The training field stretched wide beneath the blazing noon sun, a barren patch of earth hardened by countless drills, marshes, and sparring matches. Dust lingered in the air, stirred by the restless shuffling of boots as the regiment gathered in tight formation. The clang of canteens and the soft creak of leather belts filled the silence. 100 men stood shoulder to shoulder, backs stiff but eyes darting with curiosity. Something unusual was about to happen. At the center of it all stood General Harris. Tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, Harris carried himself with the easy authority of a man who had commanded battlefields and survived them. His chest was decorated with faded ribbons, reminders of wars past, but his expression was as sharp as ever. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his weathered face, though his gray eyes burned like steel beneath it. He raised one gloved hand, and the murmuring ceased instantly. "Men," his voice rang out, deep and commanding, rolling across the field like thunder. "Discipline is not forged in comfort. It is tested. It is revealed when least expected." The soldiers exchanged wary glances. Harris was infamous for his unpredictable tests. Sometimes he ordered forced march through mud. Other times surprise inspections that left even the toughest sergeant scrambling. But today felt different. "I require a volunteer." The words hung in the air, heavier than any command to march or dig trenches. Harris's eyes scanned the rows of men, his gaze sharp enough to make seasoned fighters shift on their feet. A single bead of sweat trickled down the cheek of a young private, though whether from the sun or nerves, no one could say. For a moment, no one moved. The silence stretched on, awkward and suffocating. Men who had faced gunfire on distant fields found themselves reluctant to take a single step forward now. Each wondered what trap the general had set, what grueling task awaited the unlucky soul who volunteered. "Do you all fear me so much?" Harris said slowly, his voice tinged with disappointment, "that not one of you dares step forward?" Boots scuffed against the dirt. Someone coughed. A ripple of unease passed through the ranks. The general's challenge had cut deeper than they expected. To refuse was cowardice. To accept might be foolishness. From the far side of the formation, a soldier whispered under his breath, "Keller should do it." All eyes flicked toward the towering figure of Sergeant Keller. The drill sergeant stood like a statue, arms crossed, jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. Keller was the terror of recruits, the iron fist of discipline in human form. He had broken men down and rebuilt them into soldiers through sheer brutality and grit. If anyone was expected to rise to the general's challenge, it was him. But Keller remained still, his gaze locked on the general. More whispers spread. Why doesn't he step up? Is he waiting for something? Maybe this isn't about strength. The tension grew unbearable. Harris let the silence drag, his face hardening with each second. And then, "I'll volunteer." The voice was quiet, almost timid, but in the silence it carried clear. Heads turned sharply, eyes searching for the source. There, at the edge of the formation, stood Thomas Reed. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Some laughed outright, unable to contain themselves. Thomas, the regiment's supply clerk? The man who spent his days hunched over ledgers, scribbling numbers, tallying rations, and organizing crates of ammunition? He was the last person anyone expected to see stepping forward. One soldier snorted. "This has to be a joke." Another whispered, "The clerk? He can barely lift a musket without tripping over it." But Thomas didn't retreat. He stood there, slim and unassuming, spectacles glinting in the sunlight. His uniform was cleaner than most, the fabric faded, but not battered by the dirt and sweat of constant drills. Ink stains clung faintly to his fingertips, the badge of his endless paperwork. Yet his eyes, usually lowered and hidden, now looked straight ahead with a calm, steady resolve. General Harris's brows arched. For the briefest moment, surprise flickered across his face. Then the corners of his mouth twitched in something that might have been amusement or respect. "Step forward, Reed," he commanded. Thomas obeyed, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth as he walked to the open space before the general. Every eye followed him, some mocking, some curious, a few even pitying. Harris studied him carefully. "You understand what this means, Clerk Reed?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said, his voice steady though quiet. "You may face humiliation, pain, perhaps worse. And yet you volunteer?" "Yes, sir." The general's gaze bore into him for a long moment, as if trying to read the depths of this unlikely man. Then Harris turned his head, looking past Thomas to the rows of soldiers. Sergeant Keller. The name cracked through the air like a whip. Keller stepped forward at once, his boots thudding heavily. He towered over Thomas, the difference between them almost comical. Where Thomas was lean, Keller was broad and muscled. His arms looked carved from stone, his chest barrel-like, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass. The soldiers erupted in a chorus of cheers and whistles. "This is unfair," someone laughed. "The poor clerk's about to be crushed." Keller's eyes narrowed as he looked Thomas up and down. "Sir, with respect," he said gruffly, "this man isn't fit for such a test." "That decision," Harris interrupted, his voice icy, "is mine." And Reed has stepped forward when none else did. He has earned his chance. You will give him no mercy. Keller's lips twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. "As you wish, sir." Thomas met Keller's gaze. He didn't flinch. For a heartbeat, the entire regiment seemed to hold its breath. The general had issued his challenge. The sergeant, the strongest among them, had been chosen. And the man who stood against him was not a warrior, not a seasoned fighter, but the quiet clerk they had all overlooked. Harris raised his voice once more, carrying it over the crowd. "Remember this moment, men. Courage does not always come in the form you expect. Strength does not always wear the face of the strongest. What happens next will be a lesson to every one of you." The soldiers leaned forward, eyes locked on the strange pairing before them. Anticipation buzzed through the air like static before a storm. And at the center of it all stood Thomas Reed calm, still and impossibly brave. A ripple of disbelief coursed through the regiment as Thomas Reed stood before them. The supply clerk ink-stained fingers, mild manner, known more for his quiet diligence than any feats of strength, was the man who had dared to step forward when no one else had. It seemed almost absurd. The laughter came first. It rolled through the ranks like a sudden wave, breaking the tension of silence. Men nudged each other, grinning in disbelief. "Reed?" one soldier chuckled, shaking his head. "The man can't even carry 2 crates without stumbling." Another added with a grin, "What's he gonna do? Throw ledgers at Keller?" Even the younger privates, usually more cautious with their tongues, allowed themselves a few snickers. Thomas was invisible most days, a shadow in the supply tent, his presence acknowledged only when equipment went missing or when rations needed sorting. That man was now standing at the center of the field, facing the general without a trace of fear. But not everyone laughed. Some watched in silence, their brows furrowed. It wasn't courage they expected from Reed, but there was no mistaking the calm steadiness in his eyes. He hadn't stumbled forward by mistake. He hadn't been pushed or pressured. He had chosen to volunteer. General Harris lifted his hand, and the laughter died as swiftly as it had risen. His gaze swept across the soldiers, silencing them with the same authority that could still a battlefield. "You mock him because you did not step forward," Harris said, his voice sharp. "Yet he has the courage you lacked. Remember that." The words cut deep, and a heavy quiet settled over the regiment. The men exchanged uneasy looks, some ashamed, others resentful. Thomas didn't speak. He stood at attention, not puffed with pride, not trembling with fear, just steady. Harris's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before turning to the massive figure of Sergeant Keller, who stood waiting like a storm ready to break. "Sergeant," the general said, "you will be his opponent." The announcement sent another wave through the soldiers. Gasps, whistles, even a few muttered curses. The outcome seemed decided before it had begun. Keller stepped forward, his boots striking the ground with weighty confidence. Every inch of him radiated power-broad shoulders, thick arms, a chest that filled his uniform like armor. His face, chiseled and stern, carried the scars of battles and brawls alike. He was the very embodiment of military discipline, a man who pushed recruits to their breaking points and beyond. When Keller came to stand opposite Thomas, the contrast was almost comical. The clerk looked like a boy beside a giant. Lean, unimposing, his frame swallowed by the loose fabric of his uniform. A hush fell over the camp as Keller looked him up and down. "Sir," Keller said to Harris, his tone clipped but respectful, "this isn't a fair contest." "He's not a fighter. He's a clerk." The general's jaw tightened. "The clerk is a soldier of this regiment, as are you. And he volunteered where others did not. That is fairness enough." Keller's eyes flicked back to Thomas, hard and assessing. Then, after a beat, he gave a curt nod. "As you command, sir." The soldiers around them couldn't contain themselves. The jeers began again, though quieter this time, tempered by the general's warning. "You're going to get flattened, Reed," someone muttered from the back. "This'll be over in seconds." Hope he wrote his will in those ledgers of his. But beneath the taunts, there was a new tension. Something about the scene didn't sit right. It was too strange, too unexpected. The air was thick with anticipation. Thomas finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "I accept the match." His words weren't boastful or dramatic. They carried no bravado, only certainty. And that certainty unsettled more men than his silence had. Keller smirked faintly, folding his arms across his chest. "Tell me, Reed," he said, his voice carrying enough for those nearby to hear, "what makes you think you can stand against me?" Thomas met his gaze evenly. "Because no one else would, Sergeant." The simplicity of the answer hit harder than any insult could. Keller's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something else: respect, perhaps, or at least recognition of Reed's resolve. General Harris stepped between them, his presence commanding. "This contest will be clean. No weapons, no tricks. Strength, skill, and courage will decide the outcome." He looked first at Keller, then at Thomas, making sure both understood. "And you will both give everything you have?" "Yes, sir," Keller said firmly. "Yes, sir," Thomas echoed, his tone softer, but just as steady. The soldiers shifted restlessly, their excitement building. A few whispered wagers were exchanged, coins changing hands. Most bet on Keller. Of course, he was the obvious choice. But a handful of men, noticing the calm in Reed's demeanor, quietly placed their wagers on the unlikely clerk. "Reed's about to surprise us," one private whispered to his friend. "You're mad," the friend hissed. "Look at Keller. He's built like an ox." "Sometimes it's not the ox you have to worry about," the private replied. General Harris raised his hand, signaling for order. "Form the ring." At once, soldiers moved to create a wide circle around the two men. Boots scraped against dirt, rifles clinked as they were slung aside, and the air buzzed with raw anticipation. Thomas stood within the circle, hands at his sides, shoulders loose. He wasn't bouncing on his heels like a fighter, nor was he stiff with nerves. He looked prepared. Keller rolled his shoulders, the sound of muscle and bone stretching audible even in the quiet. He clenched his fists, each one as big as a hammer, and gave Thomas one final look. "Don't say I didn't warn you," Keller muttered. The general stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the ring. His voice rang out, clear and firm. This contest is a test of more than strength. It is a test of will. Remember that. The circle of soldiers leaned forward, breath held, waiting for the signal. Thomas inhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with controlled calm. His eyes never left Keller's. General Harris dropped his hand. Begin. The crowd erupted, the roar echoing across the camp. Dust swirled as Keller lunged forward, a force of raw muscle and aggression. Thomas stood ready, small and unassuming against the storm that came for him. The unlikely match had begun. The circle of men pressed tighter, boots grinding the dust into the earth, eyes locked on the two figures at its center. The energy around the ring was alive, like the crackling before a thunderstorm. On one side stood Sergeant Kellerbroad, grim and unshakable. His fists flexed, veins rising like cords of rope beneath his skin. He rolled his shoulders, every movement radiating confidence, as though this contest was already won. On the other side stood Thomas Reed, the quiet clerk who had shocked the regiment by volunteering. He did not bounce, did not snarl, did not clench his fists as if preparing to crush. Instead, he stood calmly, posture loose, hands steady, eyes fixed squarely on Keller. It was the posture of a man who had no illusions, but also no fear. General Harris's gaze swept the ring. He measured the tension in Keller's jaw, the unusual stillness in Reed's eyes. Then he barked a single word that cracked through the air like a whip. Begin. The ground trembled beneath Keller's first step as he surged forward, his boots pounding with the rhythm of a war drum. He came like a battering ram, fists raised, his shadow falling long over Reed. Gasps and shouts rose from the circle. Here it comes. This'll be quick, watch him drop. But Reed didn't move. Not at first. He stood rooted in place, calm even as Keller's massive frame bore down on him. And then, at the very last moment, he shifted. It was not a panicked flinch or desperate leap. It was precise, calculated. Reed stepped aside with smooth, almost graceful timing, and Keller's momentum carried him past, missing his target by inches. The sergeant skidded, boots digging into the dirt, barely stopping himself from crashing into the line of men. He wheeled around, eyes narrowing, teeth clenched. "What the hell?" he growled under his breath. The crowd erupted in shouts of disbelief. "Did you see that?" He slipped right past him. "No way, that was luck." Keller shook his head, squaring his stance again. "You got one dodge, Clerk," he muttered. "That's it." Reed said nothing. He simply adjusted his footing, as if measuring the ground beneath him, his breathing even, his gaze never leaving Keller. The sergeant came again, faster this time, leading with a crushing right hook aimed for Reed's jaw. The kind of blow that had dropped recruits in a single strike. But Reed ducked. The punch whistled past harmlessly, Keller's arm cutting through the air with nothing to stop it. Reed pivoted on his heel, his body moving with surprising fluidity, and slid just out of reach again. Dust kicked up around his boots. The crowd's laughter had died. Now voices were hushed, uncertain. "Is Reed trained?" One whispered. "He moves too clean to be guessing." "Impossible. He's just a clerk." Keller's frustration deepened, his face flushing red. He snarled, teeth bared, and launched forward with a flurry of strikes left, right, left, each one carrying the weight of his towering frame. Reed's body swayed, bent, twisted, every dodge timed with uncanny precision. His footwork was subtle but sharp, each step angled to avoid, each lean calculated to slip the blow. He wasn't throwing punches, not yet. He was learning, watching, waiting. The sergeant's blows meant nothing but air and dust. Sweat gleamed on Keller's brow, his breathing growing heavier. He had expected to crush Reed with a single charge, to flatten the quiet man and end humiliation. Instead, he was chasing shadows. The ring of soldiers grew louder now, no longer laughing but shouting, torn between disbelief and excitement. Reed's dancing around him. Look at Keller. He can't touch him. Come on, Sergeant. Don't let him show you up. Keller roared, swinging again with brute force. But Reed slipped under the strike, his glasses catching a glint of sunlight as he straightened just out of reach. For the first time, Keller's eyes widened not in fear, but in recognition. This was no accident. Reed wasn't lucky. He was skilled. The sergeant spat into the dirt, chest heaving. You've been hiding something, Clerk, he growled, circling now instead of charging. His voice was low, but carried in the tense silence. Where the hell did you learn to move like that? Reed finally spoke, his words calm, almost casual. I've been working since I could walk, Sergeant. Not here. Back home. On a farm. The soldiers exchanged confused looks. A farm? One scoffed. What's that got to do with anything? Another asked. But Keller knew. He could see it now, the steady endurance in Reed's stance, the balance, the patience. A boy who'd spent years lifting, hauling, bending, twisting. A man who had worked with his body until the motions became second nature. Keller's smirk returned, sharp and dangerous. Then let's see if farm work can stand against steel. The crowd roared as the sergeant lunged again. But this time, Reed didn't fully dodge. He sidestepped just enough, and as Keller's fist sailed past, Reed's hand shot out, fingers locking around the sergeant's wrist. Gasps exploded from the ring. Reed twisted, not with brute force, but with practiced leverage, using Keller's momentum against him. The sergeant stumbled, his footing faltering, his massive frame jolted sideways. He tore his arm free with a grunt, but not before the shock registered on his face. The quiet clerk had just caught him. The soldiers shouted in disbelief, some cheering, others protesting. Did you see that? He grabbed Keller. Reed grabbed him. This can't be real. Keller's teeth clenched as he reset his stance, fury burning in his eyes. But beneath the anger was something else, something rarer. Respect. You're better than I thought, he admitted grudgingly. But don't think dodging will save you forever. Reed didn't answer. He simply raised his hands slightly, no longer at his sides, his body lowering into a stance that spoke of readiness. It wasn't the rigid posture of military drills, nor the aggressive stance of a brawler. It was balanced, patient. The crowd grew silent again, the tension suffocating. Sergeant Keller inhaled deeply, his chest rising like a bellows. He knew now that this wouldn't be over in one strike. The clerk had skill, control, and something no one else had seen until now. Nerve. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. All right, Reed, he said softly, almost to himself. Let's give them a fight they'll remember. And with that, Keller advanced again, more cautious this time, while Reed's steady gaze followed his every move. The battle had only just begun. The dust swirled at their boots, carried by the restless stamping of soldiers who crowded tighter into the ring. The air was thick with tension so heavy that even the usual chatter of the camp had vanished. The cooks at the mess tent leaned out. Recruits abandoned polishing rifles. Even the medics paused, craning their necks to see. In the center, Thomas Reed stood with quiet composure, his posture loose but ready, while Sergeant Keller loomed across from him, fists clenched, jaw set, eyes burning with humiliation and fury. The general's sharp gaze moved between them. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was its own command. Keller broke it first. With a guttural roar, he charged, fists swinging in a vicious arc. The movement carried the weight of raw muscle, years of drills, and the confidence of a man who had never once been bested in front of his men. The blow came for Reed's head like a hammer. Gasps erupted from the ring. Down he goes. This'll end it. But Reed was already moving. He ducked low, Keller's fist cutting through the air so close it stirred his hair. Dust burst around Reed's boots as he pivoted, slipping neatly to the side. Keller's momentum carried him forward, and Reed turned with it, brushing past his opponent's shoulder. Keller stumbled 2 steps before catching himself, spinning around with a snarl. His teeth were bared, his breath sharp. He hadn't expected Reed to escape again, especially not so smoothly. The crowd roared. "What, did you see that?" He slipped right past him. "The clerk's faster than he looks." Keller's face flushed crimson. He came again, swinging with his left this time, then his right, each punch thunderous with power. Reed weaved and bent, his movements sharp but controlled, like a man who had learned to conserve his strength. Each miss drew more disbelief. He's making Keller miss. No one makes Keller miss. But Keller was not a man who gave up easily. He pressed forward, blow after blow, trying to corner Reed, trying to crush him under sheer force. His fists blurred, his muscles strained, sweat began to bead across his forehead. Still, Reed evaded, slipping, stepping, ducking, never more than inches away from destruction. To the watching soldiers, it was like watching a man dodge falling trees in a storm. Any one of Keller's punches could have broken bone, shattered ribs, ended the match outright. And yet none connected. Then it happened. Keller, enraged, lunged too far, overextending in his rush. His boot slipped in the dirt, just enough to stagger his balance. Reed saw it instantly. He stepped in, not back, not away, but in. His hand shot out, seizing Keller's wrist in a tight grip. With a twist and a pivot of his hips, Reed redirected the sergeant's momentum. Keller's massive frame lurched sideways, pulled off balance. His boot scraped desperately for purchase, but Reed followed through, angling his body with precision. The sergeant stumbled, crashing down to one knee. The crowd erupted like cannon fire. He caught him. Reed took him down. Keller ripped his arm free with a snarl, scrambling back to his feet, his face dark with rage and humiliation. Never had he been dragged to his knee in front of his men. For the first time, he looked at Reed not as a clerk, not as a nuisance, but as an opponent. "You little bastard," Keller growled under his breath, pacing around Reed now instead of charging blindly. "You've been hiding this. All this time." Reed said nothing. He stood ready, breathing evenly, his hands slightly raised now, no longer pretending to be a man armed. The soldiers were no longer mocking or laughing. Their eyes were wide, their voices urgent, their disbelief turning into something else entirely. Reed's holding his own. No, he's beating him. What's happening? Keller never loses. General Harris remained still, his arms folded across his chest. But behind his calm expression, a spark of satisfaction gleamed. This was what he had wanted. His men tested, their illusions broken, their pride stripped bare. Keller spat into the dirt, circling like a predator now. His chest heaved, his knuckles red from pounding the air and earth. His pride screamed for him to end this. His fury demanded it. He lunged again, but this time with caution. A feint to the left, a strike to the right, testing Reed's reactions. Reed moved with the same calm precision. He ducked, stepped, twisted. Each motion efficient, no wasted energy, no panic. He wasn't just surviving, he was studying. Keller swung again, faster, harder, his fists blurring. Dust rose in clouds around them. The ring of soldiers leaned closer, shouting, gasping, their voices overlapping in a roar of disbelief. And then Reed struck back. It was not a heavy blow, not a punch meant to drop a man like Keller. It was sharp, quick, aimed with intent. As Keller's arm shot past, Reed's fist snapped forward, striking cleanly against the sergeant's ribs. The sound was small compared to Keller's thunderous swings, but the effect was immediate. Keller's breath caught, his chest jerking slightly as pain stabbed through his side. Gasps echoed. Reed hit him. He landed a strike. The sergeant staggered half a step, eyes blazing in shock. He had been touched. Not grazed, not brushed hit. Reed didn't press. He stepped back, steadying himself again, watching Keller carefully. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't trying to knock the sergeant out. He was proving a point. Keller wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his chest heaving harder now. The strike hadn't dropped him, but it had shaken him. More than that, it had humiliated him. You've got guts, Reed, he snarled, circling once more. But guts won't save you. The soldiers roared encouragement now, some for Keller, some unbelievably for Reed. Wagers shouted across the ring changed hands. Men who had bet on the sergeant earlier now cursed themselves. Others shouted for the clerk, their voices cracking with excitement. The match had shifted. It was no longer a one-sided spectacle. It was a battle. The general finally spoke, his voice carrying over the chaos. Watch closely, men. What you see today is a lesson none of you will forget. Pride, strength, rank, they mean nothing without discipline. And discipline, it seems, may hide in places you least expect. His words only added fuel to the fire. Soldiers shouted louder, straining to see every move, every strike, every dodge. Keller surged again, his pride demanding dominance. Reed met him with the same calm, measured precision, sidestepping, weaving, striking when the chance arose. Dust rose higher, the ground trembling beneath the weight of the sergeant's fury and the clerk's defiance. The first clash was no longer about ending the fight. It was about proving who truly belonged in the ring. The air in the ring pulsed with heat and dust, every man watching caught between disbelief and exhilaration. Keller's chest heaved like a furnace, sweat streaking down his temple, while Reed stood across from him, calm as a still pond. It wasn't the calm of arrogance, it was something else. Something deeper. The soldiers couldn't explain it, but General Harris could see it plain as day. Reed wasn't fighting out of pride. He was fighting with the discipline of a man who'd known harder struggles long before this ring. Keller spat into the dirt, eyes blazing. You think you can embarrass me in front of my men? A clerk? His voice cracked with rage, yet beneath it lurked disbelief. Reed didn't answer. He only set his stance, steady as stone, waiting. The pause gave way to murmurs rippling through the crowd. Where'd Reed learn to move like that? He's no soldier. He's been at the desk since he came. Doesn't matter. He's handling Keller better than anyone I've ever seen. As the murmurs grew, Thomas's mind wandered not in distraction, but in clarity. Each of Keller's movements was predictable now. The heavy steps, the loaded swings, the huffing breaths. Reed could read him like an open book. And as he waited for the next attack, memory stirred. Years ago, Thomas Reed was no clerk bent over a ledger. He had been a farm boy in the quiet hills of Pennsylvania. His father, Samuel Reed, was a man of few words and endless endurance. Sunrise meant labor, sunset meant more of it, and the hours in between were filled with tasks that could break a weaker spirit. Thomas had hauled bales of hay until his shoulders screamed, chopped wood until blisters bled, and driven plows through stubborn earth with only calloused hands and gritted teeth. Where others saw endless toil, his father saw training. The land don't give unless you earn it, Samuel would say, voice rough with wisdom. The weight of the plow taught Thomas balance. The swing of the axe taught precision. The push of the wheelbarrow up muddy slopes built endurance that no drill could replicate. And when storms came, tearing through fields, it was Thomas who helped anchor wagons and save livestock, his body straining against winds that felt like they could tear the world apart. By the time he was grown, he had never seen the inside of a gymnasium or felt the bark of a drill sergeant. Yet his frame was carved by the land, his will hardened by necessity. But he carried none of it like a banner. Instead, he tucked it away, quiet and unassuming. When war came and he enlisted, he chose the ledger and the ink bottle, believing others were better suited to fight. And yet, here he was his past, rising through every muscle, every measured breath. Back in the ring, Keller charged again, snapping Reed back into the present. The sergeant's fist thundered forward, but Reed caught at his hands, calloused from years of farm labor, gripping like iron. He twisted, redirecting Keller's force, and the bigger man stumbled sideways. The crowd roared. "Did you see that grip?" He turned Keller like he was nothing. "Where's he getting that strength?" Keller spun back, snarling. His pride boiled hotter with every second, but his body betrayed him. His swings grew heavier, sloppier, his breath harsher. Reed, meanwhile, stood steady, conserving his energy like a man who had learned long ago never to waste what strength he had. He countered again, a sharp elbow across Keller's forearm that made the bigger man grunt, followed by a step that forced Keller to shift his stance. It wasn't about brute force. It was control. For the first time, whispers in the crowd weren't just disbelief, they were awe. Reed's stronger than he looks, not just strong smart. He's waiting Keller out. General Harris's lips curled into the faintest smile. The lesson was unfolding perfectly. Another flash of memory. Thomas, 17, standing in the rain. His father had been thrown from a wagon, pinned under a broken axle. The wood had splintered and jammed deep into the mud. Neighbors rushed to help, but none could lift it. "Thomas," his father rasped, trapped beneath the weight. "Don't wait. You've got more strength in you than you know." With trembling arms, Thomas had planted his feet in the sucking mud. He'd gritted his teeth, hands gripping the axle slick with rain. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, but he lifted. Inch by inch, against the weight of wood and storm, he lifted until others dragged his father free. That day, he had learned that strength wasn't loud. It was quiet. It came from grit, not from boasting. That was the strength he carried now. Keller lunged again, desperate to reassert his dominance. But Reed sidestepped and hooked his leg just so, sending Keller sprawling into the dirt. The soldiers roared, the sound deafening. "Keller's down." Impossible. He never goes down. The sergeant scrambled back to his feet, face burning red, dirt clinging to his sweat. His fists trembled, but it wasn't just rage. It was fatigue. Reed's calm was breaking him, and he knew it. Reed, still silent, adjusted his stance once more. His eyes were steady, not mocking, not even triumphant. Just steady. That steadiness infuriated Keller more than any jeer. "You think you're better than me?" Keller spat, circling. Reed finally spoke, his voice low but clear enough for those near the ring to hear. "No, I think you've forgotten what this is about." Keller blinked, thrown off by the words. The crowd hushed, leaning closer. "This fight isn't about pride," Reed continued, his tone calm as the storm around them. "It's about discipline, control. You're stronger than me, Keller. But strength without control is wasted." For a moment, silence reigned. Even the soldiers forgot to cheer. Then Keller roared, charging with everything left in him, fists swinging wild. But his rage betrayed him. His body, already taxed, moved slower than his fury wanted. Reed slipped past him once again, catching his arm, pivoting, and slamming the sergeant's own weight against him. Keller stumbled, crashing down hard into the dirt, the breath whooshing out of his chest. The ring exploded with sound. Reed's got him. Unbelievable. Clerk my ass, he's a fighter. Keller coughed, struggling to rise, but his body rebelled. His arms trembled, his legs weak from the onslaught of his own wasted energy. Reed stood above him, not triumphant, but resolute. The strength he carried wasn't just in his arms. It was in his discipline, his patience, his refusal to be ruled by pride. And now, every soldier in that ring saw it. The general's voice finally broke through the thunder of cheers. Men, remember this moment. You've just seen the truth of strength. It does not always wear stripes. It does not always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly at a desk until called upon. His gaze shifted toward Reed, sharp with respect. And when it is called, it does not falter. The soldiers cheered louder, the sound rolling like thunder across the camp. Reed, though, only lowered his stance, breathing steady, his eyes never leaving Keller. He knew the fight wasn't over, not yet, but the balance had shifted. The quiet clerk was no longer invisible. His hidden strength had been revealed, and nothing in the regiment would ever look the same again. The camp was no longer a quiet ring of soldiers. It had become a storm. Every man shouted, some for Keller to rally, others for Reed to finish him, but all were caught in the fever of the fight. The air shook with the weight of their voices. Keller's chest rose and fell like a bellows, his broad shoulders slick with sweat and dust. His fists, still dangerous, trembled from exhaustion. Yet the fury in his eyes burned hotter than ever. Pride was the fire that drove him now. Pride and humiliation. Reed stood across from him, breathing steady, watching. His shoulders loosened, his stance calm. The calmness infuriated Keller. It was like Reed wasn't even struggling. You think you've beaten me? Keller spat, wiping sweat from his brow. His voice cracked, raw with rage and fatigue. You've just been running, dodging. You're nothing but a coward in a clerk's skin. Reed tilted his head slightly. His voice, though quiet, carried across the ring. If that were true, he said, you'd have finished me by now. The soldiers roared at the reply, their shouts crashing like waves. Some laughed, some jeered, others bellowed in astonishment. Keller's face twisted crimson. His pride stung deeper than any blow. With a roar that shook the camp, Keller charged. His fists blurred, swinging with reckless abandon. Left, right, each punch a hammer meant to shatter Reed where he stood. Dust erupted around his boots, his massive frame driving forward like a storm. But Reed was no longer just evading. He began to answer. Keller's right fist whistled past Reed's cheek, and Reed countered with a sharp jab to the ribs. Keller grunted, the breath jolting from his lungs, but pressed on. A left hook swept through the air, and Reed ducked, answering with a quick strike to Keller's midsection. Each counter was small, controlled, precise. A pebble against a boulder. But pebbles can wear stone smooth, and each strike drained Keller further, forcing him to stumble, forcing him to feel the weight of his own exhaustion. The soldiers noticed. Reed's hitting him. Every swing Keller throws, Reed answers. He's wearing him down. Keller staggered back, chest heaving, his massive fists lowering slightly. He shook his head, furious, refusing to accept what his body screamed. He lunged again, swinging wildly, but his power was slipping, his speed waning. Reed sidestepped and hooked his foot around Keller's ankle. With a deft twist, he sent the sergeant stumbling forward. Keller caught himself on shaky legs, but Reed was already there. Another sharp strike to the ribs, another quick jab at the shoulder. The crowd's roar grew deafening. Reed's turning it around. He's got Keller on the ropes. General Harris's eyes glimmered beneath his stern brow. The demonstration was no longer just a test of courage. It had become a revelation, Keller's vision blurred with sweat. His arms felt like they were made of lead. Every breath was fire, every movement agony. He had built his reputation on sheer force, on breaking men with relentless pressure. But this man, this clerk, was dismantling him piece by piece. His pride screamed to end it, to crush Reed beneath one final devastating blow. With a guttural roar, Keller summoned what strength remained. He pulled his fist back, muscles screaming, and hurled it forward with everything he had left. The air cracked with the force. But Reed was ready. He stepped inside the arc of the swing, his body moving with perfect timing. He caught Keller's arm beneath his own, pivoted his hips, and drove his shoulder into the sergeant's chest. The move was clean, efficient, devastating. Keller's massive frame lifted for the briefest instant before slamming into the dirt with a thunderous crash. Dust exploded around him, the ground trembling beneath the impact. The soldiers erupted into chaos. He threw him. Keller's down again. Impossible Reed just dropped him like a sack. Keller lay on his back, gasping for air, the fight draining from him like water from a cracked barrel. His fists twitched, his legs struggled to move, but his body refused to obey. Reed stood over him, his chest rising and falling evenly, sweat streaking his brow, but his composure unbroken. He did not gloat. He did not cheer. He simply waited, watching, ready if Keller rose again. For a long moment, the camp fell into silence, the soldiers staring in disbelief at the sight before them. The drill sergeant, the man who had terrified recruits, who had ruled the ring with iron fists, lay broken in the dirt, bested by the quiet clerk no one had noticed. Keller groaned, forcing himself onto his elbows. His pride refused to let him stay down. He staggered to one knee, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. "You won't beat me," he gasped, spitting blood into the dirt. Reed crouched slightly, meeting his eyes. His voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. "I don't need to beat you, Keller. You've beaten yourself." The words struck harder than any punch. The crowd murmured, the soldiers exchanging stunned looks. It was true. Keller's fury had driven him to waste his strength. His pride had blinded him to discipline. Reed had simply endured, waiting, conserving, striking when it mattered. Keller's arm trembled as he tried to rise, and then collapsed beneath him. He fell back into the dirt, gasping, unable to continue. A fight was over. The soldiers exploded into cheers, the sound shaking the camp to its core. Some shouted Reed's name. Others clapped each other on the back, still unable to believe what they had seen. General Harris raised his hand, and the noise dimmed just enough for his voice to carry. "Men," he thundered, "you've just witnessed what pride and strength alone cannot achieve. You've seen discipline triumph. You've seen patience triumph. And you've seen that courage may come from the man you least expect." He gestured toward Reed, who still stood calm and steady in the ring. "This clerk has taught you all a lesson. Remember it well. A soldier's worth is not measured by his rank or his roar, but by his discipline, his heart, and his control." The camp erupted once more, the soldiers' voices lifting Reed higher than any metal could. Reed, however, remained humble. He stepped back, offering Keller a hand. For a moment, the sergeant glared at it, his pride still raw. But at last, with a grunt, he took it. Reed pulled him to his feet, the two men standing eye to eye. Keller's voice was low, broken, but honest. "You're no clerk." "Not anymore." Reed only nodded. "I've always been a clerk. But today, I was a soldier too." The soldiers roared at the words, their voices echoing across the fields. The tide had turned, not just in the fight, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. The dust still hung heavy in the air, a ghostly haze drifting between the figures in the ring. Keller stood on shaky legs, his pride fractured, while Reed remained calm, his breathing steady, his posture unbroken. The ring of soldiers roared with disbelief, triumph, and awe, their voices filling the camp like thunder rolling across distant hills. But then one sound cut through the storm. Silence. It was the general. General Harris's voice was sharp as a blade, commanding as cannon fire. Instantly, the noise died. The soldiers stood frozen, their eyes snapping toward the man who carried more weight than any fight ever could. Even Keller stiffened, his fists unclenching, his rage dissolving into dread under that withering gaze. The general stepped forward into the ring, his boots crunching in the dust. He looked first at Keller, then at Reed, then at the circle of men surrounding them. His silence carried its own gravity. The soldiers shifted uneasily, knowing something monumental was about to be said. "Do you know what you have just witnessed?" General Harris began, his tone low but thunderous enough to carry. No one answered. The men glanced at each other, nervous to speak. The silence was absolute, save for the crackle of the fire and Keller's ragged breathing. "You think you saw a clerk beat a drill sergeant," Harris continued, his eyes sweeping the ring. "But that is not what happened. What you witnessed was something far greater. You saw discipline defeat pride. You saw patience defeat rage. You saw control defeat chaos." He let the words hang, each one dropping like a hammer on the anvil of their minds. The soldiers shifted again, glancing at Reed with new eyes. Only hours ago, he had been invisible, just another face behind the paperwork. Now, he stood taller in their imaginations than any man in the camp. The general's gaze turned on Keller. "Sergeant," he said, his voice cutting sharp, "you are strong. No man in this regiment doubts your power. But strength without discipline is a fire in dry grass. It burns bright, fast, and leaves nothing but ash. You fought not for honor, but for pride, and pride is a poison that rots the core of a soldier." Keller's face burned red. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but the general's glare froze the words in his throat. Slowly, painfully, he dropped his head in silence. Harris turned next to Reed. "And you?" His tone shifted, not soft, but measured, like steel tempered in flame. "You carried no rank. You carried no reputation. Yet you showed every man here what true soldiering looks like. Not with shouts, not with boasts, with control, with heart, with discipline." Reed met the general's eyes, his expression calm. He did not bow, did not smile, did not claim triumph. He simply listened. The general raised his voice now, addressing the regiment. "Mark this day well, men. Remember it as long as you wear this uniform. A clerk has shown you what it means to be a soldier. A sergeant has shown you what it means to forget it. And I," his hand swept across them all, "expect you to learn from both." The soldiers erupted not with jeers, not with mockery, but with cheers. Their voices rose not for Keller, not even for Reed alone, but for the lesson that had struck them all. "Reed, Reed, Reed." The chant started small, a ripple at first, then surged through the crowd like wildfire. The quiet clerk, who only that morning had been a shadow among them, was now the name on every lip. Keller stood still in the ring, his jaw tight, his pride stinging under the chant. But instead of lashing out, instead of storming away, he turned to Reed. His eyes burned with something different, now something closer to respect, though grudging and heavy. "Clerk," he said hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the roar, "you've got more soldier in you than I gave credit for." Reed nodded once, simply replying, "And you've got more in you than your anger allows." The words struck again, not as insult, but as truth. Keller swallowed hard, lowering his gaze. For the first time in years, he had been taught a lesson, not by a superior officer, but by the man he had dismissed as insignificant. The general stepped closer to the two men, his presence commanding the silence back into place. "This rivalry ends here," Harris declared. "From this moment forward, there is no clerk. There is no sergeant. There are only soldiers equal in duty, equal in discipline." His eyes sharpened. "Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Keller rasped, voice low but firm. "Yes, sir," Reed answered calmly. The general nodded once, then turned to the gathered men. "Dismissed." But dismissal was not the end. As the soldiers broke into smaller groups, their voices buzzed with excitement, their eyes never leaving Reed. Some clapped him on the back, others shook their heads in disbelief. The man they had overlooked, ignored, and even mocked was now a figure of respect, perhaps even legend. Around the edges of the campfire, stories already began to grow. "Did you see how he dodged that swing? Like lightning. And the way he threw Keller down, God, I'll never forget it. I swear, he never even broke a sweat." The tale spread like wildfire, gaining shape and color with every telling. Already it was becoming larger than the fight itself. Reed, however, slipped quietly away from the circle of praise. He did not bask in it. He did not crave it. Instead, he found his way back to the desk where his ledgers and ink bottle waited. He sat, shoulders relaxed, hands steady, and resumed his work as though nothing had happened. That, more than anything, astonished the men. For while they saw in him a warrior now, Reed had not abandoned who he was. His humility was as unshakable as his discipline. Later that night, General Harris stood outside his tent, gazing toward the stars that glittered cold above the camp. Captain Miller approached quietly, his face still marked by awe. "Sir," Miller said, "what happened today?" "I've never seen anything like it." The general's eyes remained fixed on the sky. "You will see it again, Captain, if you learn to look for it. The greatest strength does not always roar. Sometimes it waits quietly, until the moment it is called." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And God help us, Captain. I pray we have more men like Reed before this war is done." Miller nodded solemnly, understanding more than the general needed to say. Back in the barracks, Keller lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. His body ached, his pride still burned, but his thoughts churned deeper. For years he had believed fear and brute strength were the keys to leadership. Now, for the first time, he questioned it. Reed's words echoed in his mind. Strength without control is wasted. And though he would never admit it, aloud not yet, he knew the truth of it. Across the barracks, Reed sat quietly with his ledger, writing by lantern light. His hand moved steadily, each line neat and precise, as though the day's fight had never happened. To him, it was not a victory to be boasted of. It was a duty fulfilled. And that, more than the fight itself, would leave the deepest mark on the men who had watched him. The general's judgment was not just a verdict on a fight. It was a verdict on the regiment itself, a reminder of what soldiering truly meant. And as the camp settled into uneasy silence that night, every man carried the weight of that lesson with him. Some carried it with pride, some with shame, but all carried it. And none would forget the day the quiet clerk stood taller than the drill sergeant. The sun rose over the camp the following morning, casting long golden beams across the tents and dusty training fields. The soldiers moved through their drills with a new rhythm, faster, sharper, but tempered by something deeper. Whispers of the previous day's fight lingered in the air like a hidden current, carried in every glance toward the supply tent where Thomas Reed had resumed his quiet duties. Reed, as always, worked methodically, stacking crates and checking inventories, his ink-stained hands moving with the same precision that had once dodged and countered every blow from Sergeant Keller. The men passed him now with respectful nods, and some even paused, eyes lingering, unsure if they dared to speak to the man who had changed everything. "Morning, Reed," one soldier said, finally breaking the silence. Thomas looked up, calm and unassuming, and nodded. "Morning," he replied, voice steady, as if nothing had happened. The soldier glanced around, hesitant. "Sir?" "About yesterday. You were incredible." Reed's lips curved faintly in the hint of a smile. "I did what was necessary. That's all a soldier can ever do." And that was the truth. Thomas never sought glory. He never wanted attention. But the soldiers, seeing the man behind the clerk's quiet exterior, could no longer see him as ordinary. Word of the fight spread quickly through the regiment. By mid-morning, nearly every soldier had retold the story in their own way, embellishing it slightly, always ending with Reed standing tall while Keller lay in the dirt. By noon, the legend had grown beyond the camp. Recruits who hadn't witnessed the fight demanded to see the clerical warrior for themselves. Officers shared the tale with visiting superiors. Even the cooks in the mess tent stopped stirring stew to recount the clever dodges, the swift counters, the calm determination that had carried Reed to victory. Yet Thomas remained unchanged. He did not revel in the stories, nor correct the exaggerations. To him, it was simply a day that tested the limits of his patience, skill, and endurance, and he had passed. That was enough. Keller, however, faced the day differently. He walked through the camp with a quieter step, his massive frame still impressive, yet humbled. The pride that had once defined him now wrestled with a grudging respect for Reed. Though he had been vested, he refused to let it break him completely. Instead, he approached the clerk with an unspoken acknowledgement of his lesson. "Reed," Keller said finally, voice low and roughened by pride and effort, "I owe you respect." Reed glanced up from the ledger he was checking. "You earned it," he said simply. The sergeant nodded once, stiffly, and moved on. That small interaction carried more weight than any speech or announcement. It was a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that builds camaraderie stronger than forced drills ever could. The rest of the day unfolded with unusual energy. Soldiers moved with a new purpose, performing drills with precision and attentiveness. They practiced with greater focus, not just to obey commands, but to internalize the lessons of endurance, patience, and control they had witnessed firsthand. Even the rookies, who had arrived with wide eyes and trembling hands, carried themselves differently after hearing the story of Reed and Keller. By evening, the camp had settled into a calm that seemed almost reverent. The fight had left its mark on every corner, the footprints in the dirt where Keller had stumbled, the flattened dust where Reed had pivoted and countered, the lingering whispers of astonishment that drifted through the tents. Some men gathered quietly by the training grounds, speaking in hushed tones. "Did you see how he used Keller's momentum against him?" One murmured. "It was more than just skill," another replied. "It was patience, strategy, wisdom. He's not just a clerk anymore. He's a soldier in every sense." And so the legend grew. Even the officers began to take note. Lieutenant Douglas, who had doubted Reed the day he volunteered, now approached him with cautious respect. "Reed," he said, "your actions yesterday, they've set a new standard for this regiment. Discipline, focus, courage. You've taught all of us something invaluable." Thomas merely nodded. "I only did what I had to do, sir." But Douglas knew that words could never capture the weight of what had been done. The quiet clerk had transformed into a symbol, a living example of what discipline and resolve could achieve. Night fell over the camp. Lanterns flickered in the tents, casting long shadows across the earth. The soldiers lay on their cots, their thoughts consumed not by their own fatigue, but by the story of Reed the clerk who had defeated the drill sergeant. For some, it became a source of inspiration. For others, a lesson in humility and respect. Even in the quiet moments, the impact of the fight lingered. A private, thinking back on his own struggles with training, whispered to himself, "If Reed can do that, maybe I can too." And that was the true legacy. It was not about fame or accolades. It was about awakening something deeper within the men who had witnessed it, a belief that courage, patience, and discipline could surpass even the mightiest physical strength. Keller, sitting alone by the training grounds, ran a hand over his bruised ribs. Pride still burned in his chest, but it was tempered now by understanding. He had faced a man who was weaker in size, but stronger in patience, and he knew he would never forget the lesson. "You've got more than I thought, Clerk," he muttered quietly, almost to himself. "I only did what was right," Reed replied from the edge of the lantern light, calm and measured. Keller nodded slowly. It was the only acknowledgement needed, yet it spoke volumes. The fight had ended, but its lessons would resonate long after the dust settled. Weeks passed, and the story of Thomas Reed continued to grow. New recruits arrived, asking about the clerk who bested the drill sergeant. Veterans recounted the battle with vivid detail, ensuring that no one forgot. Reed became a figure of quiet respect, a living legend whose presence reminded every man in the regiment that true strength was measured not in force or fury, but in patience, discipline, and the courage to stand when others would not. Even the general mentioned Reed to visiting officers, recounting the story as an example of what it meant to truly embody the spirit of a soldier. Yet Thomas remained unchanged. Each day he returned to his ledgers, his ink, and his meticulous organization of supplies. To him, the work mattered as much as the fight. To him, the true test was not the cheers of the crowd, but the quiet, steady fulfillment of duty. The men came to understand that. They respected him not just for the fight, but for the way he carried himself afterward. Humility and strength intertwined, shaping him into a figure that would inspire long after he had left the ring. In quiet corners of the camp, men repeated the lesson to themselves. Discipline is stronger than rage. Patience is more powerful than pride. Courage can be found where you least expect it. And in those lessons, the legacy of the quiet clerk endured. As the sun set on the camp, casting long shadows over tents and training fields, Thomas Reed paused to glance toward the horizon. He had stepped forward once, when no one else would, and in doing so, he had not only proven his own worth, but transformed the hearts and minds of an entire regiment. He returned to his desk, picking up his pen and ledger, the quiet rhythm of his work resuming. Outside, the camp settled, but the story would never be forgotten. The legend of the quiet clerk had been written not in ink, but in courage, discipline, and the unwavering resolve of a man who refused to be overlooked. And that was the legacy he left behind.